Yes.
Am I not even old enough to get that reference?
I think it might be Das FX. Diggity wiggity wiggity from like
Das FX.
I think that was their name, rap hip hop group in the early 90s. I think that's what their name was, Das FX. Let me see if I'm saying that correctly. Das.
This is literally ringing no bells whatsoever.
Yeah. It's DAS space EFX. Yeah, let's see if I could play you a brief clip so maybe you will, you might have remember the beat. Do like the first like regular. Where's the gravy? Buckle my shoe. I don't know, man. All I know is I remember a lot of the words. I'm like, God damn, that's amazing how music does that.
This might be the whitest thing two guys have ever done is stream that early 90s hip hop over a Zoom call recording a podcast.
Yeah, that was probably one of the biggest songs when I was a kid.
I feel like I vaguely remember that, but that wasn't definitely, that's not a core memory.
I'm not sure if I was in high school yet. I'd have to see the year that it came out. If it was, I was in high school yet or I was still in junior high school, but that song was.
I think I remember the supercalifragilistic parts.
Yeah.
I feel like I vaguely remember that. That's what's triggering it for me. But otherwise, it's just kind of all blurs together.
Yeah, so just how much it resonated that it's still in my vernacular 30 years later.
There you go. All right. Well, let's go ahead and kick this off, right? It's another episode of Idiot Seeking Village. Welcome, everyone. My condolences that you're listening to this, but I'm Rich, and along with my co-host, Adam, we're attempting to answer the eternal question. Like, Adam, seriously, give it to me. How do you fold a fitted sheet?
I don't.
Do you? Okay, so you go with the crumple it into a ball and throw it into the back of the linen closet approach.
I let my wife do it, or we try to do it together, so it looks okay.
Teamwork.
Yes, teamwork makes the dream work. But I would not try to do that myself because it's just I like it. If I'm going to do something, I want it to be done nicely, and if I can't do it, I just don't do it.
I think what you need to do in order to successfully run this as a solo project is you need to play DOS effects in the background.
Yes, get amped up.
You need to be blasting that. Exactly. You need to be amped up. You need to be in the right headspace.
That's my new. It's going to go viral on YouTube and Instagram. Guy who listens to rap while folding sheets.
That's how we're going to blow up our audience and really kind of hit those triple digit, quadruple digit numbers, right? It's going to be a video of you dancing, listening to that, folding a fitted sheet. Yeah. That's how the internet works, man. I don't make the rules.
Yeah, old school hip hop, and have maybe my kids could watch me and look at me in like shameful eyes.
Yeah, so they're going to be ashamed of you anyway. I think nothing personal, just that's my kids going to be ashamed of me as well. That's how they operate. But you might as well give them something to be ashamed of and get famous in the process.
Yes. See, who's laughing now? The internet, Daddy. The internet.
They're laughing at you, not with you.
Who cares? Look at the views. Look at the views.
It's probably the most effective way of getting them to never post anything on the internet themselves is for us to get out there, put ourselves out there, and for them to go, absolutely not. I'm never doing that.
No, I can't put myself out there. They'll know I'm related to this guy.
It's the modern day equivalent of you catch your kid smoking a cigarette, and so you make him smoke the entire carton.
Yeah. Or you're doing it with your friends who are just like a bunch of bums, and then they look at they're like, are we mirroring this? We have to stop. Why did they start that podcast? To make sure their children never went on the internet.
We wanted our children to live as hermits, as far away from civilization as possible. So we started a podcast in order to embarrass them publicly and irrevocably. They changed their names. Ah, that's fantastic. So a lot happened this week, Adam. I mean, a lot. So might as well dive right into it because enough of it has an impact and it matters. So as you saw on September 22nd, the White House issued an executive order. They designated Antifa as a domestic terror organization, which I think you and I both found interesting because there is no federal register of domestic terror organizations. It is not any sort of legal designation that is tracked in any way, shape, or form.
Not a thing.
And the executive order, didn't actually call for the creation of a domestic terror list. It just said to call Antifa one. And the State Department, they run a list of foreign terror groups, but domestically, there's no register of U.S.-based groups. When we think about like the FBI or Department of Homeland Security, their domestic operations, they track white supremacist groups. They track anti-government militia groups, Proud Boys, KKK, Patriot Front, guys like the Timothy McVeighs of the world, right, who are part of Patriot militia movements and stuff like that. They're tracking those. But those aren't official terror groups.
Right.
And that's why if you're like the KKK or the Proud Boys, even today, you can host a parade. You can file for a permit at town hall to host a gathering because you're not officially a terror group. You might be a hate group, but constitutionally that's protected, right? And as long as you're not explicitly calling for violence and imminent violence, they have the right to speak without government denying them, the right to peaceably assemble.
Yeah, we need to be reminded of that. That we let that occur, but outspoken comedians and disagreeing comedians, nope, can't have that.
Oh, God forbid you play back someone's video of themselves just completely not caring about the death of another person and then changing the subject. And yeah, that gets you canceled for 24 to 48 hours. That's, yeah, exactly.
That's evil. But you can walk the streets with the Nazi flag as long as you're not trying to take that Nazi flag and banging it in someone's head.
Or wrapping it around their face or anything like
Yes.
that. Yeah, exactly. Or as long as you're not imminently inciting violence with it or actually doing violence with it. So, yeah. And look, this contrasts with being designated like a foreign terror organization by the State Department. That has specific legal consequences. Again, domestic terror group doesn't have a consequence, but even like these groups that are tracked by the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, there's no legal consequences to that. They're just on the radar of law enforcement. But if you're a foreign terrorist organization, the State Department is tracking you, it becomes illegal to provide any sort of support for that kind of group once you're designated, right? Mm-hmm. Money, training, supplies. You can express vocal support, but that's going to get you probably questioned, even at that point. Banks are obligated to freeze accounts that are related to foreign terror groups as part of that. And any member of one of those groups or suspected member can be denied visas to enter the country or be deported from this country if they're already here. So I think we need to remember that like executive orders, they're legally binding within the constraints of existing law, right? They don't create new laws. What they really do is they exist to direct the management and operations of the executive branch and its various agencies and implement policy. Like they're about day-to-day management. Let's just say you're focused on 2 or 3 different things as an agency, right? You've got this kind of mandate. The executive order is basically just saying, hey, look, this one's your priority. Focus your resources on this. Mm-hmm. You can't fight everything all at once. Resources are limited. Just pick and choose your battles. That's really what the executive order does. Like if you think about like local law enforcement, the cops in your town, like there might be something going on that you don't like and you want the cops to take care of. Let's just say you've got panhandlers or something, but there's a lot of laws. And unless like the local district attorney is eager to prosecute those people for that particular crime, the cops aren't really going to go out and take care of that issue, right? They've got other things that they've been told to focus on. And they're like, don't go after everything. We don't want to prosecute these things. They're not really a concern of ours. It's not a priority. That's really the way the executive order is to think about, like the top of the government is telling police and prosecutors to prioritize certain areas, certain crimes. Right. The law already exists and the executive order is like, just pay attention to this one. This is where I want you to spend your time and energy. And I think we see this in the executive order about Antifa. Quote from the executive order, "This order shall be implemented consistent with applicable law. This order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity by any party against the United States, its departments, agencies, or entities, its officers, employees, or agents, or any other person." End quote. So the executive order, honestly, it's a whole lot of nothing. It's really nothing more than just pandering to Trump's base. And frankly, I'm honestly surprised he hadn't already done it, which really just kind of emphasizes that there's a threat of Antifa, but it's just how performative this whole executive order is. Antifa is not a group. There's no local chapters. It's more of an ideology. And it's just people who broadly oppose fascism, right, in the 21st century. There's no, like, leader of Antifa. There's no founding membership.
No Discord chat room.
Not that I'm aware of, but, like, people who might call themselves Antifa or be like, I consider themselves Antifa, definitely have a Discord chat room, right? But there isn't, like, an official Antifa chapter or, Antifa group. Like, there is a Communist Party of the United States. Mm-hmm. Like, there is... Yeah, everyone knows about the NRA, right? The National Rifle Association. There's a Socialist Rifle Association. And these guys, they have official, like, lead groups and they have chapters, right? And things like Antifa doesn't have a parallel to that. So I think about it too. Antifa is actually interesting. Have you ever dug in on it at all?
Not really. I just remember just watching them on TV with big signs.
Basically, right? So the original Antifa actually existed just briefly in the run-up to World War II. Their predecessors were actually started by the KPD, the German Communist Party. And they were primarily, this is interesting, anti-social democrat and anti-socialist as a front. They actually sometimes cooperated with Nazis to fight the social democrats because they were the more mainstream centrist party. And the communists who founded the original Antifa, they were focused on anti-capitalism behaviors at the time. So they looked at the Nazis, and there were like very anti-capitalist elements within the original Nazi party. And they were getting their orders from Stalin, from the Soviet Union, as most communist parties were at that time. And they were like, look, we actually have more in common with these guys than we do with the Social Democrats because they're pro-capitalist, we're anti-capitalist. So we'll work hand in hand with them sometimes to meet our goals. But once the Nazis started to rise in power, of course, they clamped down on everyone, as we talked about last week. They shut down organizing and broke up meetings and all that sort of stuff. So the KPD, the German Communist Party, reformed the groups as, they weren't actually called anti-fascist, but they reformed them in 1932 as Anti-Fascist Action. It was too late to counter the Nazi ascendance, but they gave us our first official Antifa group. And again, this was the German Communist Party. The Nazis heavily suppressed it after they took power. And it was also suppressed by the post-war authorities because they were like, it's not about anti-fascism. It's just, we didn't want political factionism and we didn't want like rowdies in the streets. Like, we've got enough shit to do here. And at that point, it was basically dead and done. So the modern Antifa that really Trump is talking about and that we are talking about today, it has its roots in the 70s, 80s as a response to the rise of neo-fascism and skinheads. Do you remember skinheads?
Oh, the good old days, yes.
The good old days. That's one way to phrase it. A younger, more innocent time. Well, the skinheads. Exactly. The OG Antifa was Marxist-Leninist. It was hierarchical. It reported to the German Communist Party, which in turn reported to the Soviet Union, essentially. The modern one is anti-authoritarian. It's much more anarchist in nature. And it grew out of like various far-left subcultures at the time and is generally a lot of anti-war, anti-establishment, countercultural revolution sort of stuff that had been proceeding at that time frame. So even though they share a name, the current Antifa and the original Antifa, they're not the same thing at all. I think the way I think about it, at least, is you compare it to like the term libertarian, right? When I say libertarian, what do you think?
Do as you like within certain guidelines, but basically free to do whatever you want. I just see them as, I know they're very like big on personal property. The government shouldn't be involved. They want as little tiny government as possible and just like free to live within their own confines. Right.
The libertarian, the way we know it today, is it's a right-wing term, and it's often associated and in a lot of ways interchangeable with Republicans and things that on the right. Actually, libertarian was an anarchist term. They use terms anarchist, they use libertarian and libertarian socialist, like kind of more or less interchangeably. There's a joke That kind of goes, two leftists walk into a bar and then three splinter groups form. So they had multiple ways of describing themselves. Like, do you ever Monty Python, Life of Brian? Did you ever watch that one?
Many moons ago. Many.
Gotcha. One of the more amusing scenes, to me at least, is that they have that whole argument about the Judean People's Front versus the People's Front of Judea and the Popular Front of Judea. They're talking about all these different resistance splinter groups to the Roman occupation, to the Roman Empire. And it's all about leftist infighting and purity testing. And it's just, it's almost 50 years old or whatever at this point, but it totally gets to the heart of everyone's always just kind of sniping at each other and arguing. So that's kind of how the anarchists were. And so these guys came in, right? These Austrian School of Economics guys came in. They're like, we want to reappropriate that term libertarian. And yeah, libertarian is basically free market capitalism and no government oversight, no regulations. It sounds sexy until you actually try to put it into practice, because you realize most of the guys who are advocating for it, they don't believe in age of consent laws and things of that nature. And you realize, oh, you're just a bunch of perverts who have money and you just don't want the government to be able to prosecute you for your weird shit. So anyway, yeah, at this point, we're used to Trump issuing executive orders for like administrative or policy matters, everything from like tariffs, pharmaceuticals, establishing new VA facilities and things like that, to the ridiculous stuff that we tend to hear more about in the news, like the immigration gold card, banning student visas just for Harvard, purging federal workers to replace them with partisan cronies, pardoning or commuting the sentences of some 1,500 J6 rioters, right? That's the stuff that kind of gets in the news more often than not, often because it gets shut down by the courts, at least temporarily. But it's just policies for enforcement of the existing law. And the ones that are illegal, that's the one you hear about with the temporary injunctions. So compare that, the executive order, to a national security directive. So national security directives come from the National Security Council, and they have different names under different presidents, but they're about setting strategy. They don't have the force of law, but they do is they focus exclusively on like foreign, military, and defense policy, including decisions on war power, intelligence operations, and critical emergencies. And they're often classified and they're under the radar. Executive orders have a very specific definition, like they have to be published in the Federal Register. National security directives don't, and they can often take years before they're public. One example is, you ever watch a movie and it's like, we don't negotiate with terrorists? Right. Yeah, that was actually from a Carter national security directive in response to the Tehran crisis when the hostages were taken at the embassy. And then a few years later, Reagan, in a subsequent national security directive, codified it, and then he gave it over to the State Department to coordinate the various U.S. agencies when dealing with international terrorism. So those came from national security directives. Again, it's kind of setting strategy overall, but it's not a law or not within the law. One of the more infamous examples, you'll remember this, right, is George W. Bush, his directive that they codenamed Stellar Wind, the one that bypassed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court warrants, the FISA warrants, and it authorized the warrantless wiretapping on American citizens, right, having conversations with potential overseas suspects. So that's probably the more infamous one recently. I think definitely pocket that one. We're going to come back to it a little bit later. So about 3 days after this executive order about Antifa, Trump issues a national security directive. It's called National Security Presidential Memorandum. Again, the presidents all kind of have different terms and names for these, but it's being called NSPM-7 for short, just the acronym. And what he does, he lays out multiple examples of violence, like assassinations or attempted assassinations. He mentions Charlie Kirk. He mentions the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson. He mentions Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh and the attempt on him, the pair of attempts on Trump in Pennsylvania and Florida last year. The latter one, by the way, Ryan Routh, who was the would-be Florida shooter, he was actually found guilty on all charges this past week. And he was a nutter. He defended himself. Like he didn't even have a lawyer. He is cuckoo bananas.
And he tried to kill himself with a pen after.
Yes. No, the guy has been like, you talk about mental illness. The guy is all over the map. He's an interesting one. Anyway, don't want to get too distracted here. So, of course, it's notable. Trump leaves out any examples of violence by right-wingers and, MAGA violence. He doesn't mention any of it at all. He purely cherry picks, what is perceived as violence against right-wingers. That's not clearly by right-wingers. So He writes about support and organizations underpinning all this, and then he pivots, which I think is why it's concerning and why I want to bring it up today. He writes, quote, "There are common recurrent motivations and indicia uniting this pattern of violent and terroristic activities under the umbrella of self-described anti-fascism. These movements portray foundational American principles, example, support for law enforcement and border control, as fascist, to justify and encourage acts of violent revolution. This anti-fascist lie has become the organizing rallying cry used by domestic terrorists to wage a violent assault against democratic institutions, constitutional rights, and fundamental American liberties." End quote. So I want to pause there real quickly. So like two things. First, he's broadly classifying Antifa, anti-fascism, as being anti-American, right? And more broadly against founding American principles. Antifa is short for anti-fascism. It's not hard to read it the other way and be like, he's saying fascism is American. You just take the inverse of it. It's right there. And then the second one, and to me, this is like the height of irony, is by my count, at least 7 of the 10 articles enumerated in the Bill of Rights are about curbing law enforcement and government excesses that the colonists experienced firsthand during the Revolutionary War. Pretty much 1 through 6, and then 8 clearly directed at law enforcement excess. And so to portray like support for law enforcement and border control as foundational American principles is just beyond absurd, because our foundational documents are all about the rights and liberties of the people against the enforcement and overreach of the government.
Yeah. Oh, God. Live in shady times.
We do. So continuing from the NSPM, right, the National Security Presidential Memorandum, quote, "Common threads animating this violent conduct include anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality." End of quote there. Do you see the problem with that? Who decides what the traditional American view on family is? Like, what's a traditional view on religion? What's traditional morality, and who decides that?
That's easy. Whatever he says. As a layup, if it's only anti-Christian, that means, therefore, all the other ones are wrong. And so, Christian values.
Why is it only anti-Christianity and not anti-Semitism?
Because that doesn't count. It's only something we say, but we don't do.
Yeah. Like, capitalism isn't written into our founding documents. So why is anti-capitalism there? Again, all these things. What is race extremism exactly? All of this is just completely subjective. And again, it's, to your point, it's whatever he says it is, or whatever he decides he wants it to be.
Yeah, because they believe that this is a country built by Christians, and they want to return it to a white Christian nation. And that's what they want. And these are the guidelines for such a task, I suppose.
Don't concern yourself with the people actually doing the manual labor to build that white Christian nation. Don't look over in the fields. Don't look over, on the construction sites.
You built nothing. You will build nothing. You did nothing. We toiled in everything.
I'm proud of you for remembering that. Oh my God. I'm so proud of you, Adam.
Oh God. We captured you. Oh, he didn't say that part. We made you work in the fields for us. Therefore, we did it, not you.
If he had a couple more minutes, he may have added those lines. That would have been.
What a piece of garbage.
He's a piece of human garbage. Anyway, continuing. The United States requires a national strategy to investigate and disrupt networks, entities, and organizations that foment political violence so that law enforcement can intervene in criminal conspiracies before they result in violent political acts. End quote. So pre-crime.
So Minority
Remember
Report.
how a couple years ago? Exactly. I was going to say, again, listeners, turn off this podcast, go rewatch Minority Report, and then come back and continue. Yeah, just like we watched Contagion during the pandemic, let's all watch Minority Report. But I mean, honestly, joking aside, that's really concerning. We don't need to dig into a lot of history to remember overseas drone strikes under W and Obama and kind of the raft of undercover feds infiltrating mosques and other groups in the wake of 9/11, even when they had no reason to believe that anything was going on within those organizations, within those groups. And of course, the warrantless wiretapping that I mentioned earlier, right? All these activities where we try to just sweep up information en masse and to identify potential threats, even when we had no cause to believe so. Again, I believe it's the Fourth Amendment, right? Protects against unreasonable searches and seizures and require warrants based on probable cause. Once again, we're putting out a strategic directive to say, don't worry about that. Just ignore that. It's going to be what
we will decide what's reasonable and not.
Exactly, right? We decide what's reasonable, what's not, and what's right, and what's considered proper at this point. And we talked about this a little bit during our military policing episode. I know it's been a couple of weeks, but remember that series of reports by the Cochise Regional News and the Phoenix New Times where they reviewed documents outlining plans to federalize and consolidate police forces?
Yes.
I'm going to reread the quote that I gave then. Documents we've obtained discuss potential workarounds to laws that prohibit most military engagements in matters of domestic law enforcement. Documents also show the group crafted presidential actions directing military support to civilian law enforcement and contemplated invoking the Insurrection Act, which would allow for active military participation in domestic law enforcement. End quote. So this is where it gets interesting. This National Presidential Security Memorandum, NSPM-7, specifically designates the National Joint Terrorism Task Force and its roughly 200 regional offices as responsible for executing on this directive to conduct investigations and prosecute against individuals and groups. The National Joint Terrorism Task Force is basically the FBI embedded with local law enforcement where they share information around activities so that there's direct coordination on these sorts of things. And importantly, it's the JTTF. It's given explicitly the rights to coordinate with other agencies for investigation, prosecution, and may, to the extent permitted by law, request operational assistance from and coordinate with law enforcement partners when investigating domestic terrorism. So it'll be one thing, and it's still concerning if this is limited to like actual domestic terrorism, something that's not defined anywhere in federal law, and we could reasonably chalk this up to a lot of nothing. Again, just like the executive order on Antifa, it's just red meat for the base. But here's where the problem is. NSPM-7 specifically directs the Treasury and the IRS to go after funding networks and tax-exempt organizations. For example, companies and charities to file suspicious activity reports, which banks are obligated to do in cases of suspected money laundering by cartels and other groups. And for both of these agencies to refer these organizations for prosecution. So this isn't just like, hey, we're going to leverage the feds to go after someone that's not actually defined. We're actually saying we're going after you financially. Continuing from the directive, all federal law enforcement agencies with investigative authority shall question and interrogate within all lawful authorities individuals engaged in political violence or lawlessness regarding the entity or individual organizing such actions and any related financial sponsorship of those actions prior to adjudication or initiation of a plea agreement. The Attorney General may recommend that any group or entity whose members are engaged in activities meeting the definition of domestic terrorism in the United States Code merits designation as a domestic terrorist organization. End quote. So that right there, it's not just protesters at ICE facilities. It's anyone providing even direct or indirect support for organizations involved in activity that the administration doesn't like. And it's not just the people who are on the street, kind of low-level people protesting. It's funders, it's officers, it's employees, it's donors that can get swept up. This is broad enough that protected First Amendment activity could easily be wrapped up in a criminal investigation. And not just criminal, but terrorism. Right? Not all that how different from how they hit Luigi Mangione last year with that terrorism charge for killing the United Healthcare CEO. This is giving the weight of law behind it financially to investigate these people and to wrap them all up in it with terrorism charges. Even if it doesn't go past like investigation into the funding and sponsorship and just these questions, it does paint a target on the back of any advocacy group that's not aligned with the administration's goals. And it puts them in line for legal trouble that they have to defend themselves from. They can't just ignore this shit. and just be like, whatever, it's a nothing burger. And by the way, this isn't just like me saying this. Big DC law firms put out statements in the wake of this national security directive. And that's how they're viewing it. One group, Arnold and Porter.
Were they the ones that did not give money to Trump and fought him? I'm assuming.
I didn't double check the funding, but presumably, right? At least it wasn't the ones that were on his radar earlier this year that he was trying to strong arm into free legal help. Yeah, Arnold and Porter is one of them. They included this statement in their press release. The presidential memorandum makes clear that DOJ intends to target tax-exempt organizations and their funders for investigation and potential criminal prosecution, including based on activities that have historically been viewed as protected by the First Amendment. Recent reporting suggests that such investigations may be underway. By the plain terms of the presidential memorandum, even the indirect financing of political violence could have consequences for these organizations. The Elias Law Group issued this statement. The memorandum is best understood as a statement regarding the Trump administration's priorities and an intention to weaponize federal law enforcement against the president's perceived opponents to achieve those ends. Notably, the memorandum calls on the Attorney General to designate groups as domestic terrorist organizations, a term which is not defined in the federal law. However toothless on its face, the memorandum sends a troubling signal that nonprofit, political, and other civil society organizations that oppose the policies and actions of this administration face an increased risk of a federal investigation, which could lead to criminal charges or other punitive measures, such as the revocation of tax-exempt status. At a minimum, such politically motivated designations would bog down targeted organizations with legal costs and compliance headaches, all while detracting from their missions. Adam, how do you feel about us being one step closer to thought crime being illegal?
I don't know, but as you was talking, I was thinking, I want to create a party that starts with, we are the nonviolent supporters of the Constitution only. And that is what we believe in, and that is our group. And I will defend us in court. I will just hold up the paper and say, this is all we are. This is all we are. Here you go. This is ridiculous.
I don't know if you've been paying attention to overseas stuff lately, but there have been sit-ins in London. People just quietly protesting, nonviolent, just literally sit-ins, and they hold up signs that say about the whole Gaza-Israel thing. And they basically wrote, like, I support Palestinian action. I think Palestinian action is like a specific group. Okay. I don't know if they're in the UK or I don't know where they are. And they're being arrested for saying that because the UK government interprets that as direct support for Hamas and for a terror organization. These people are like, I'm literally doing nothing. I'm sitting here with a sign. Like, why are you arresting me? And not just hippie liberal girls who are getting arrested, it's grandmothers who are getting carted off and handcuffed by these cops. We're one step closer to living in that kind of reality, that kind of environment. Just like being on the wrong side of an opinion that the administration doesn't like is now an actual problem organizationally, right? It's been a joke for years that George Soros is funding all these protests, and everyone who actually goes to the protests is like, I still haven't gotten my check. Right? Did you get your check? I didn't get my check. But at this point, you got to look at it and go, yeah, no, they're actually trying to attack any sort of material support in the way that you would for a foreign terrorist organization that's labeled by the State Department, where you can't give them material support in any sort of fashion, right? Financial or anything. They're doing the same thing here with groups that they just don't like domestically.
Well, it'd be nice to just have people just support the Constitution and then them basically having no choice but to say, we don't really give a shit about the Constitution. So therefore, the Constitution is over, and then there's your official declaration of war.
So hold on to that thought, because I was having that conversation with another friend this week, and not a great outcome that we came to, but hold on to that one. Here's the thing. This is not the first time our government has done this, because of course it's not. Right. But it's realistically the first time it's been done to this extent since you or I were born. And the first time that it's been done so above board and publicly, probably ever. Adam, have you ever heard of COINTELPRO?
No, but would assume, like, does this have anything to do with like McCarthy and that time period? Because I would assume that would be the closest to like trying to pick out people and go after them.
Effectively, yes. It was actually more Hoover, not so much McCarthy, but it had a little bit to do. It wasn't because of McCarthy and that House Un-American Activities Committee, but it was related to it, right? So COINTELPRO was the acronym for Counterintelligence Program. COINTELPRO was the FBI's plan to sow discord among the leftist groups by, among other things, infiltrating them and convincing them that they'd been infiltrated by the feds and so that they turn on each other. When it came out, it was a big scandal. And there was of course a congressional investigation. So there's something called the Church Committee report that has a lot of analysis on this. I'm actually going to quote from it. COINTELPRO began in 1956, in part because of frustration with Supreme Court rulings limiting the government's power to proceed overtly against dissident groups. It ended in 1971 with the threat of public exposure. In the intervening 15 years, the Bureau conducted a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at preventing the exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association, on the theory that preventing the growth of dangerous groups and the propagation of dangerous ideas would protect the national security and deter violence. Many of the techniques used would be intolerable in a democratic society, even if all the targets had been involved in violent activity. But COINTELPRO went far beyond that. The unexpressed major premise of the programs was that a law enforcement agency has the duty to do whatever is necessary to combat perceived threats to the existing social and political order. End quote. Does that sound a little bit familiar to what we just talked about with the Presidential Security Directive and the executive orders?
Well, since it's a White House that likes to plagiarize, I would not be surprised if they were like, oh, this is a good one. Let's use this one.
I mean, in a sense, they kind of are bringing COINTELPRO back. So let's keep going here. What the FBI did is they adopted the techniques that they used at the time against hostile foreign agents, spies, and counterintelligence programs, against perceived threats to political and social establishment. They turned it on Americans with the intention of influencing policy choices and social values. It went beyond law enforcement and turned the FBI into kind of like a social or a morality police with an agenda to maintain a specific viewpoint for America that's acceptable and to attack anyone who opposed that or had issues with it. So continuing from the Church Committee report, the Black Nationalist Program, according to its supervisor, included a great number of organizations that you might not today characterize as Black nationalist, but which were in fact primarily Black. Indeed, the Nonviolent Southern Christian Leadership Conference was labeled as Black Nationalist Hate Group. Nor could anyone at the Bureau even define New Left except as more or less an attitude. Furthermore, the actual targets were chosen from a far broader group than the names of the program would imply. The CPUSA, Communist Party USA program, targeted not only party members, but also sponsors of the National Committee to Abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee and civil rights leaders alleged under communist influence or simply not anti-communist. Quote. So the names and the titles change, but the story stays the same. Mm-hmm. We're potentially going to see a lot of this, right? Progressive nonviolent groups are going to get swept up in the name of combating radical leftist violence, despite having nothing to do with it, or simply because they aren't allies of the administration and its vision of the proper social and political order. And as we saw with COINTELPRO, it's not enough to simply be agnostic on Antifa. You're presumed to be suspect if you're not openly anti-Antifa. I remember that line in the National Presidential Security Memorandum. The United States requires a national strategy to investigate and disrupt networks, entities, and organizations that foment political violence so that law enforcement can intervene in criminal conspiracies before they result in violent political acts. So get a load of this from the Church Committee report on COINTELPRO. One of these purposes was the prevention of violence. Every Bureau witness deposed stated that the purpose of the particular program or programs with which he was associated was to deter violent acts by the target groups, although the witnesses differed in their assessment of how successful the program were in achieving that goal. The preventative function was not, however, intended to be a product of specific proposals directed at specific criminal acts. Rather, the programs were aimed at groups which the Bureau believed to be violent or have the potential for violence. The programs were to prevent violence by deterring membership in that target group, even if neither the particular member nor the group was violent at the time. So I think we have to be a little bit careful here, right? Because I know this is something that like conservatives and right-wingers and that whole ecosystem, they're going to jump all over to defend this memorandum. Preventing violence is the overarching goal of law enforcement, mainly through prosecution and sentencing of crimes and criminals. If you know an action is going to have consequences, you think twice before engaging in it.
Right.
And that's constitutional. But when law enforcement attacks groups, their members, and First Amendment protected advocacy, you cross the line, right? You're doing something different than what you're intended to do. The key here is the Supreme Court case, Brandenburg v. Ohio, where a KKK leader was convicted under state law for advocating violence. The court overturned the conviction, ruling that the government can only punish speech advocating violence if it is intended and likely to incite imminent lawless action. Their words, imminent lawless action. So I'm sure if you dig back to high school and whatever you can potentially remember from there, I'm sure at some point in civics class you learned about Schenck versus the U.S., which is that whole shouting fire in a crowded theater case, right, about free speech and first. And we all learned that at some point, right? Brandenburg shifted the rights to the people much more strongly and set a much higher bar for protecting extreme or offensive speech. It turned it from shouting fire in a crowded theater could hurt people, but they made it now it's like imminent, lawless, violent action that's, intended and likely to result in violence or death.
The irony there is that it's like very like right-wing speech that has been protected of
Yes.
KKK. So it'd be just great for a bunch of people trying. What are you going to do? Threaten to be like, we want free health care for everybody. Let's get them. Wow. It's just dripping with it. Oh my goodness.
It is. I mean, think about the meeting with the generals this week when he's just talking about go in there, use the cities and the people in there as target practice, right? Like they're doing this shit all the time, all day long. And now at this point, we're numb to it. And yeah, I don't think necessarily that you can say what Trump said this week rises to the level of imminent lawless action.
Right.
But, it's in the ballpark. And it's inappropriate at the very least.
I'm wondering if there's obviously, I feel like there's probably a mastermind or two behind the scenes for all this. And they've orchestrated in such, let's use the dumbest messenger we can come up with. So people are like, he can't be really serious. This guy's an idiot, what he's saying. It doesn't make any sense. But behind the scenes, they're making it work. Because I'm like, you bring all these people together for this speech, and everybody on their mind is like, they're taking unity pledges. They're going to out of Trump. They're just going to, this whole thing is to worship Trump. And they go on a multi-hour tirade of like almost utter nonsense. Coming up with things about Gulf of America and being in shape. And you're just like, wow, they're actually addressing this to military professionals who've been doing this for a very long time and take their shit seriously. And this is how you're addressing. Like, holy shit, who's going to take this seriously? And that's maybe what their plan is.
It's very, you bring up a good point. It's very deliberate, right? Think about it this way. We talked about this, I think, last week is, making fun of our leadership and the presidents is a time honored tradition, right? Because traditionally the halls of power and leadership are areas where you're solemn, right? You're reserved. You kind of have decorum. And what do you do to attack that? You attack it with humor. And humor breaks it down. It reveals the absurdities of what's going on and the solemnity and how just stupid it is in a lot of ways, right? So the solemnity of leadership and power just can't hold up to comedy at all. It doesn't. It falls apart every single time. These guys, and again, we talked about this last week, it's all kayfabe, right? It's this perception that they're giving out there of the wrestling match and the and the drama and the storylines between the characters. But part of that is the audience buys into it, knowing that part of it is bullshit. So what they're doing is, you can look at what Trump says, how he says it, what he says, and you're like, this is ridiculous. The problem is the ridiculousness is already a preemptive attack comedically at the solemnity of the situation or of the office. And so now you can attack it more with humor to break it down because it's already been broken down preemptively. This is why mocking Trump for sounding stupid or being unable to speak properly doesn't help. It doesn't accomplish anything because they've already taken that shot at themselves and they've drawn in their audience, right, their base into that. And so it falls flat, right? It's that whole, here's the hall of presidents and here's Biden's picture and it's the auto pen signature, right? And you got, talking heads on the news are like, but it's funny. Come on, it's funny. It's like, it shouldn't be funny. It should be like, dude, that's a little bit weird and fucked up to have this in the White House, right? You do that anywhere else, it's funny. For the president to do it, you've already broken down the solemnity of the White House and the seriousness of the White House and the situation, and you've made a joke of it. And now it's how do you attack that, right? You can't do it with humor. You can't do it by pointing out the absurdity. You've already kind of shot your opponent's primary tool and weapon against you. You've already taken that away from them.
It's interesting because I'm like, maybe we should look into see if there's any old wrestling writers who have retired who now work for the Trump administration, because I could see that, like what you're saying. I was like, when you see the crowd and they're chanting at the bad guy, you suck or whatever, you stink. And the guy in the ring who's the bad guy, who's like, oh, how dare you? Oh, that's what he does. So he jokes around and stuff, but when everybody's turning on him, he's, how dare you? I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you. Oh my God, that's Trump. He's the bad guy in the ring. He's the one everybody loves to hate. That's crazy.
I've got bad news for you. Vince McMahon and Donald Trump, Vince McMahon being the WWF
his wife works for
CEO,
him, or ex-wife, right? I guess.
They're BFF.
I could see that.
Yeah, no, I mean, this doesn't come out of nowhere. Vince McMahon is very involved in all this. And so to your point, I'm sure there's writers. There might be writers. It might not go beyond Vince himself. Like,
maybe.
This is a pretty deliberate approach on their part.
Wow, that'd be crazy connection there.
It exists.
Yeah.
And yeah, obviously Linda McMahon is heading up the Department of Education, right? And she's talking about A1, right? A1 is coming for our students and they have to be ready for A1. And we all go, you mean AI? Yeah, it's a good time. It's a good time. Again, how do you make fun of something that doesn't take itself seriously?
Yeah.
You don't. You can't. Yeah, it doesn't work, right? So like the biggest weapon we've always had is humor and pointing out that the emperor has no clothes. The emperor's out there waving his dick like a helicopter rotor and saying, what are you going to do about it? And you go, well, shit, I can't point that out because we can see it, right? And he's pointing it out himself. Like, how do you can't fight that, at least not the same way.
Interesting.
Yeah. So here's the kicker with COINTELPRO. Possibly violent didn't have to mean likely to be violent. The FBI targeted nonviolent groups because it was possible that they might someday change. Possible. But they didn't have to have evidence or proof. They just could kind of be like, well, they might change their tone one day. And I think this is embodied in kind of that famous memo from FBI headquarters about Martin Luther King Jr. I'm sure you've heard this one in the past, but potentially abandoning his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines of nonviolence and embracing black nationalism. Right there, they were like, look, he's not violent now, but he might buy into his own bullshit and become violent, and so we're going to choose to treat him and track him like a violent target. So here's the thing. The difference between Trump's National Security Directive and COINTELPRO was a secretive program, and the National Security Directive is out on the open on the Federal Register. I think there's two ways to look at that, right? The first is that it's a deliberate attempt to seem tough and to intimidate the opposition, right? Part of COINTELPRO was discouraging membership in groups because you might be tracked by the FBI. And that's why they did all sort of like political dirty tricks and under the table stuff. And you could look at this like, hey, it's better to be above board, seem tough, intimidate the opposition. And rather than this being scandalous when it comes out, right, just kind of get ahead of that. Again, this administration is not stupid. They look at these things in a pretty functional or organized or at least strategic way. The second way to look at this being out in the open is incompetence, which again is very often in their remit as well, right? National Security Council directives are typically secret. And it might be that this one was published by accident, but this one's NPSM-7, right? So it's the 7th National Security Directive. 5 of the other 6 ones that he's written are public, which makes me doubt that this was an oops, that he didn't mean to do it out in the open. He could have done it privately, but I think the goal here is intimidation. I think the other key difference is that COINTELPRO, because it was a secret program, involved a lot of those dirty tricks that I mentioned, a lot of under-table stuff. The goal was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize target groups. And they would ransack houses and offices without warrants. They would infiltrate groups and start rumors. They would mail letters to people's spouses to make them think that their partner was having an affair. And they actually credited themselves with one marriage kind of going off and failing because of that. It may have just been already kind of there and just pushed it over the edge. But it just basically agent provocateur stuff. Think of like the CIA trying to kill Castro in a million creative ways, like exploding cigars and all that bullshit and failing. That was the FBI with COINTELPRO targets domestically.
Jeez.
Speaking of the CIA, Adam, have you ever heard of Project Chaos?
No, I have not.
Right.
I'm sure it's going to bring chaos.
I wish you had responded, I can neither confirm nor deny.
Sorry to disappoint.
So, again, from the Church Committee report, the most extensive program of alleged domestic spying by the CIA on Americans was the Chaos program. Chaos was the centerpiece of a major CIA effort begun in 1967 in response to White House pressure for intelligence about foreign influence upon American dissent. The Chaos mission was to gather and evaluate all available information about foreign links to racial, anti-war, and other protest activity in the United States.
How was chaos spelled? I just want to please tell me it was like K-A-O-S.
Nope, C-H-A-O-S. Nope. It was in all caps, though, so I actually didn't find if it's an acronym for something else. Okay. But, yeah. It also had a second function. Project Chaos wasn't just, is any of this domestic unrest because of foreign influence? It also had a second function, which was to monitor Americans abroad and report that back to the FBI. Presumably, and likely, sometimes operating under the auspices of COINTELPRO. So CIA agents who were like embedded with radical domestic groups who were building cover for overseas operations. Like if someone's like, hey, I'm a black nationalist, so I'm going to join this black nationalist group and I'm going to use that as street cred to get in with some sort of extremist, group overseas. They would build their cover that way organically, right? They would actually join the groups. They would collect reports on American citizens in the process of being embedded with these groups. They would open their mail and they would collect NSA intercepts, and they shared those with the FBI, as well as creating thousands of their own dossiers on the activities of Americans. Now, Adam, if you know one thing and only one thing about where the CIA is supposed to operate, where is it?
Not in America.
Correct. Yes. Their charter forbids operating domestically. Or at least that's the general interpretation. Truman and the others who wrote up the National Security Council Act of 1947 that founded the CIA, right, converted the OSS into the CIA. They didn't want to explicitly say that the CIA was for foreign spying because they were like, we don't want our allies going, what the fuck, you're creating a spy agency. They also didn't want the CIA to become like a Gestapo and to be used for political purposes by existing administrations against their political opponents. So Section 102 of the National Security Act, the same one that, by the way, that had established the National Security Council and the directive we've been talking about today, same act, states that the agency shall have no police, subpoena, or law enforcement powers or internal security functions. That's the one line that's basically is interpreted as they're not allowed to operate domestically because they have no legal powers here. Here's the thing, though. The agency, and in the case of Project Chaos, they did this. They've interpreted this or they've at least implied that this allows them to spy on Americans when they are investigating links to foreign intelligence assets because they're expected to conduct counterintelligence operations overseas. So if one of their targets is talking to a person domestically, they're like, well, of course I can track this person because it's part of, it's related to the project I'm supposed to be able to do. I think it's important to note that chaos wasn't initiated by the CIA. It was actually kind of reluctantly done so by the head of the CIA at the time. It was LBJ and Nixon who were convinced that the increasing unrest in the U.S. from student protests, opposition to Vietnam, the rise of the New Left, and black nationalism were being fed by foreign governments looking to destabilize the U.S. And you could tell this from a November 1967 cable from Langley that stated that, for purposes of this study, we are attempting to establish the nature and extent of illegal and subversive connections that may exist between U.S. organizations or activists involved and Communist Front, or other anti-American and foreign elements abroad. Such connections might range from casual contacts based merely on mutual interest to closely controlled channels for party directives. So, if you think about it, different language, but it sounds really eerily similar to this national security directive that Trump put out last week. What are the connections? Who's involved? How casual or direct are these things? And let's go after all of them. So yeah, I think we could spend hours covering the details of COINTELPRO and Project Chaos. But I think these are the relevant concepts that, again, like we talked about last week with the Reichstag fire, that rhyme with what's going on without being like, this is the exact same thing. It's like, it's not the exact same thing, but holy shit, it sounds very, 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 very similar.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And it should be concerning, right? Because these programs at the time came under extreme scrutiny and criticism and are in no small part blamed for the fact that we just don't trust the government anymore. Right. Once our government started spying on us secretly, that was it. And when it was, I want to express my First Amendment right to assemble, to free speech, to petition, and you've got law enforcement agencies actively undermining that, how do you trust the government, right? How do you believe that it's operating in your best interest? You don't. You just don't do that anymore. And I think we pair that with the military summit this week and more proclamations that they're going to invade U.S. cities, and they've gone into Portland in the past few days. And we see that these things are moving forward. And one thing that we didn't talk about last week was the possibility of a military coup as a counter, as a solution to all this. And I have to really imagine, at least from Trump and Hex's perspective, that was an underlying purpose for this summit, right? Those guys, you watch a video, they were clearly not impressed by this rally bullshit that these guys put on, right? This isn't their base. This isn't a wrestling match.
Yeah. Right.
And they're not buying into the kayfabe. These, the generals, they didn't need a pep rally from a drunk TV host.
Right.
They did conduct a purge of perceived non-loyalists earlier this year. And these guys have to know that the X factor in shit hitting the fan has to be the military doing the unprecedented and cooing them and taking them out of power. And I mean, to me, the stupidest thing they could have done is threatening the liberties of civilians in this way, and then gathering all of the officers in one place where they can then talk to each other and grab a beer after the audience.
My only theory would be that they probably had a lot of cameras in that room, film everybody's reactions to all these things. Hopefully most of them were stoic or whatever, but trying to pick out what they could during, before, after, listening, who they could pick out of the audience of generals that they would be very receptive to them, and keep them, because I know they want to start getting rid of more generals because there's too many of them apparently, and start raising their ranks up. And this is the long con. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. They got years to go, and I would assume more and more years after that, because I cannot. When you protest fair elections this much, you're not going to have one again. So I'm assuming this is the long game, and they're just going to build these guys up. And hopefully that the generals that they have in place at the end of everything are ones who stand there up for them and not the other way around.
Yeah, you have to wonder, what's the disconnect between the generals, the top brass, and the service members, right, and their opinions. Because traditionally, troops follow their leaders. They follow the chain of command, and you know, let's just say there's a 50-50 split in the brass between supporting Trump and, thinking that what he's doing is constitutional. And then the other half are like, no, what he's doing is not constitutional. Like, where does it go from there? Right. It could get that alone could just stop anything from happening.
Right. Exactly.
But I mean, to me, the really frustrating thing is just how many people are not actively okay with we're invading American cities, but they're actively cheering it on. Right. And so many of these folks, left, right, whatever, they claim to hate violence. They don't want conflict. They might even like consider themselves like don't tread on me types. Yet they're openly cheering for heavily armed military and policing responses against citizens.
Yeah, because, you just said it with don't tread on me. They want you to be treaded on. You want you to be treaded on. Not me, you.
But on everyone else except for me. Yeah. I mean, and look, this could be liberals as well, right? It could be conservatives. It's really both. It's a little bit of everyone. Yeah. To me, this is what Dr. King was talking about in his letter from Birmingham jail when he talked about the biggest blocker of justice is moderates who prioritize order over justice. Is that they want the absence of tension more than they want the presence of justice.
It sounds like the Democratic Party.
Yeah, 100% it's the Democratic Party. It's especially, that was 60 some odd years ago. It's still the Democratic Party of today, right? The Democrats will say one thing, but they push comes to shove, they're not a leftist group. They're not fighting the establishment. The Democrats are very much protecting the status quo, the existing order. Absolutely. And I mean, I'll say this, right? And so it's not surprising when liberal types are like, I just want things to be nice and calm and peaceful, so I don't care what happens underneath to keep that going. To me, though, if you're like the Gadsden flag type, if you're the don't tread on me, it should be extremely concerning when the government treads on anyone.
Right.
Not just people you agree with or yourself. It's that fundamental selfishness. Just because you like look down at your nose at someone or you don't like them doesn't mean that they don't deserve the same protection that you yourself enjoy.
Right. Well, maybe we need to change that flag and just have the don't tread on us part instead.
Or just don't tread, right? Or I like the version that Ben Franklin put out there. I believe it was Ben Franklin, the unite or die version that preceded it, where it was each of the individual colonies as segments of the snake. And it was like, either get it together, unify, or we're going to get crushed.
I like that.
Yeah. I have that hanging in my house, dude. It's pretty cool. Because I think at a certain point, right, if the law doesn't apply equally to everyone and it isn't just, you have to ask yourself, like, why do we even have laws in the first place? Why even have the law? If they're just going to be used to attack one group over another, and those decisions are just purely based on who happens to be in control of the law and have the levers of power, then a law is meaningless. It has no objectivity. And why should we respect it in the first place?
Yeah.
When we see this all the time, right? There's definitely a perception that there's at least a two-tier justice system. People in power get away with everything and anything that they want, and the rest of us get screwed for like the smallest little infractions.
Yeah. Money is power.
Yeah. Oh, man. I don't know about you, but do you ever like daydream years ago before all this shit happened? Like, what would you do if like this kind of authoritarian or fascist regime ever took power? Do you ever like imagine the kind of sabotage you get up to or what you might do?
No, never got that deep into it because I would just get bummed out. So I would just be like, let's just move on. Let's think of something else.
Okay, fair enough. I didn't think too deeply about it. But I was kind of like, yeah, no, of course I'd get up to like some sort of sabotage or throw a wrench into the works, right? And kind of gum things up. And I think the crazy thing is you look at all of us today collectively as a country and what are we doing? We're not, there's some people in the streets protesting, right? There's a small handful, a small portion of people. But like for the most part, we're all answering emails and doing fucking laundry.
Yeah.
And, to me, that's a not insignificant factor as to why people are not more alarmed by this sort of stuff. They expect fascist takeovers to look like the opening scenes of Red Dawn. Right? Instead, life looks largely the same. There's a blog post on Mad in America on a tweet by a guy named Cliff Garrison from 2022, which is really apt, which is he talks about the way, we need to cope with all this because if we don't cope, then we don't water the plants, and then you end up with both fascism and dead plants.
I like that. I mean,
yeah, no, I thought it was.
it's a long. Analogy. I think you got to pace yourself because this is not going away tomorrow. You could protest all you want; they're not going to give a shit, and there's nobody, on a white horse coming to save you. So you have to wait until they basically, once they don't let you have the fair election, is when you start coming out. That's what I think is the point of no return. That's when you start. Then you start lining up because now hey, this just happened. This is what we could go back to. This is when you start protesting in vast numbers. But right now, it's just, you got years to go.
See, that's the thing. I want to ask you this because I was having this conversation with another friend of mine a few days ago. And
stop rubbing it in that you have so many damn friends.
Dude, 2 friends, you and this other guy. So yeah, that's it. Friends plural. I get to say plural because there's 2 of you, right? Relax. But I'd already written this episode and we're kind of just having some surface level conversation about some of these topics. And, he has a lot of the friends he grew up with. They're all huge MAGA. They're huge Trumpers, right? And I respect him for this, but I also think it's bad for his mental health. He's always trying to have an argument with them or point out facts. And they keep going you're brainwashed. You don't know what's going on. And he's like, what the fuck are you talking about brainwash? You're operating purely on vibes. And I'm coming to you with facts and data that, show that you're wrong. And we got to the question of, and we really struggled with this one, is if Trump literally abolished elections tomorrow, tens of millions of people wouldn't even blink at that. And they would find all sorts of ways to justify it as the right move and completely necessary.
Oh, I'm sure.
And so I'm asking you, I mean, you're saying you think that's a tipping point for people, but I think, honestly, is anyone who's considers themselves MAGA, right, and still supports Trump at this point, if he came out and said, I'm voiding elections, would they actually be opposed to that?
Oh, I would say the majority probably no, because once again, they're stopping elections to ensure what they wanted to begin with. So why would they give a shit? They're not thinking about years in the future, whatever. If you're going to stop elections now, you're going to codify, you're going to permanently put in place what I voted for. So fuck it, let it ride. That's just everybody else will. And then you'll have some few people who've Trump lost over the time frame. I probably wouldn't have voted for him if I had another chance because somehow they were delusional in the first place. They become undelusioned. They would then go. But yeah, you have millions of people. Who protests? It's kind of like your team was accused of cheating and you won. You're not going out there and protest the fact that your team cheated and you should give it back. Most people are not going to do that.
Yeah, exactly. It's was it banners fly forever, right? You win the championship. It doesn't matter how you got there.
Right.
No one takes that away from you. No one voids it. It's funny because if you were like, well, what if Obama or Biden or someone had canceled elections? They'd be all up in arms.
Absolutely.
But because they're guys in power and they perceive themselves as being in charge, they're okay with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a tough one. I just worried that our kids just won't have a concept of normalcy as they're, once they start becoming adults and start paying attention more to what's going on around them, because their status quo and our status quo will be very different and they won't have a perception of normalcy that we do right now. I feel like this is tougher for us than for future generations.
Oh, let's hope that things move very quickly nowadays, that normalcy comes back around and it's better than before.
I mean, you pointed out a while ago with Nepal, the Nepalese kids overthrew their government. Mm-hmm. There's been protests in the Philippines. There's been actually a lot of grassroots kind of revolutions going on recently. I actually kind of want to dig into it on a different episode. I'll do a little bit of research on it, but I want to leave off with this thought I had. And this is, I think, a conversation I had with you years ago, but I was trying to tie all this stuff together. I'm someone who's always liked ancient history and, of course, to understand Rome and stuff, because it was, it's the republic that turned into an empire. It was the inspiration of so much of our founding ideals and the symbology of our own country. So it's kind of hey, I want to understand it better. And I think the reality is, looking at it, Rome, the empire fell in 476 AD. It wasn't some Roland Emmerich doomsday movie. It wasn't a bunch of wreckage from a Michael Bay action scene. It's what we talked about earlier. Like this fascism is just kind of quietly creeping in. It's not suddenly jackboots in the streets. It's all this under the radar stuff that's typically out of sight for most people. And I think about, the reality of the end of that for everyone who lived through it wasn't as big to do. It's just, if you live further from the Imperial Center, you progressively heard less from the Imperial Center, and you saw fewer people from the Capitol and saw less money coming from that general direction. And eventually, after a period of time, it all but stopped. And then it just did stop. And after enough time, it was nothing more than a memory for fewer and fewer people until new generations simply had no concept of what being Roman meant and what citizenship and being a subject entailed for them. And so I hope you're right. I hope that things move quickly so that we can get to a resolution. But if it drags on, again, the status quo, the default, will continue to shift for more and more people. And this sense of normalcy that we perceive is going to get further and further in the rear view. And there's no guarantee that it goes back to something good necessarily.
Right. But if it gets bad, I have a feeling people will just be like, wait a minute. Do you remember when it was better than this? Especially since you have a movement right now where you're trying to make America great again, and it just has gotten worse. You're like, I don't think we're making it great again. Seems shittier. Oh, I don't like this. Let's hope that's the effect.
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I think at some point people are going to look back past this MAGA movement and look at the period of relative peace and economic growth, and they're going to want to go back to it in the same way that MAGA wants to go back to some mythical time before, that never really existed.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have anything profound to finish this with.
I think that was profound enough.
Yeah. We'll see what happens. All right, bud. Did you learn anything today?
As always, a lot to digest. But it did frighten me a little bit to think that these are the main characters we see on TV are just really not politicians, and they're really not. They're actors. You got Trump, you got Heads, Kegseth. They're personalities. They're not really leaders. Patel. They're all just personalities, and that really does fit a wrestling vibe, which is a great deal of his base to begin with. It's something to really think about.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. How much of his administration is just plucked straight from TV? Right? These are people playing a role. It's an act.
Yeah.
That they're doing. And again, by preempting the absurdity of it all, they make it difficult to attack.
100%. Americans now need to turn on the heel like we always do. And they are the heel.
Yes. We need our heel turn. Where's our heel turn? Let's go for it.
Yep.
All right, dude. And I look forward to you and I recording from our secret bunker next week as we go into hiding from the authorities. Well, I'll catch you later.
Sounds good, man.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Idiot Seeking Village is a production of Village Idiots Media. For more, find us online at villageidiotmedia.com or find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, and wherever you get podcasts.